often, particularly in families, that there's so much history. There's so much. You get together with your family, and you're all having a nice chat around the Christmas table or whatever, and there's so much underneath the surface that is not being said, that everyone is to a greater or lesser degree aware of, but we've all agreed not to speak about it. Yeah, it's just too difficult, it's too painful, so let's talk about Father Christmas or whatever. So we're having this conversation, but some more than others are aware of this undercurrent just below the surface, usually not very deeply below the surface. And some of us are less willing to play the game of avoiding what's below the surface and just carrying on sweetly chatting. So you're having this conversation, you get halfway through the conversation and you become aware of what's really going on around the table, what's going on just below the threshold of conscious thought. And what you feel at that moment, what you describe as grief or sorrow, is actually partly your own, but partly the conflict, the sorrow, the difficulties that are contained in the family, that are all the held feelings that are implicit but are not being expressed and resolved. And you become very aware of that, particularly, as you say, when thought ceases. The main function of thought and its extension, conversation around the table, is precisely to prevent what's really going on being fully felt. It's too painful. So let's keep thinking and talking, because as long as we're talking 19 to the dozen, there's no room for these feelings to be fully felt. So the purpose of much of our social intercourse is precisely to keep this deeper feeling of grief and sorrow at bay. Now, in you, you describe these moments where thought comes to an end. You can't keep up the charade any longer. You're so acutely aware of the sorrow that's just below the surface, and it doesn't matter whether it's your sorrow or the sorrow doesn't belong. It's the collective sorrow. In this case, the collective sorrow or grief in the family, and you become very sensitive to it because the veneer has cracked. You can't hold it together anymore. You can't put a smile on it. So you become very aware of it, and you become at the same time aware that other family members can't afford to be aware of it, that they're not willing to let themselves be aware of it. It's too painful. So right there, their resistance to their sorrow is another layer of sorrow. It breaks your heart to see that people are so afraid to allow these feelings to come up, and all this layer of social intercourse is designed precisely to keep it all at bay. So that's what you're feeling. What do you do about it? You do about it exactly the same thing that you do about all these kind of feelings, whether they're apparently your own or apparently belong to the community, in this case your family, which is you do nothing about them. And by doing nothing about them, I mean you know yourself at that moment as this open, allowing space, which is completely open to these feelings, that isn't suppressing them, isn't trying to avoid them, isn't afraid of them. isn't trying to avoid them through activities or substances, isn't trying to suppress them through fear. It's just totally open, no agenda with them. Not going to launch into a mission with your mother-in-law or your whoever it is, because you don't have an agenda. You're not going to start trying to change these feelings, but nor are you willing to play the game of avoiding and suppressing them. So you're just totally open to them. But that also means open to the conversation. You know, open to the conversation, because that's also part of what's going on. You see what the conversation is designed to do. It's designed to avoid having to feel this undercurrent of sorrow, but you don't judge the conversation. They're doing their best. They're doing what they've been conditioned to do. It's their way of coping. They don't know better. So there's no judgment or avoidance of the conversation. There's no judgment or avoidance of the undercurrent of sorrow. You're totally open to it all, or rather, you know yourself as that one which is already totally open to all of it. And that's the position you take. You don't take a position. You find yourself as that one, and you respond as that one. So you may still engage in what appears to be this superficial conversation. You may continue talking about the weather, but your conversation is informed by the position you are taking, which is actually the absence of a position. In just the same way that we did with the experiment earlier, you carry on the conversation about the weather, or the Christmas cake, or whatever it is. But somehow you're part of the conversation. What you bring to the table will be deeply informed by the place at which you stand. Somehow, even if your words remain the same, something of where you are coming from, something of your feeling, understanding, will deliver itself, will express itself. It doesn't mean that it'll transform the situation in a few minutes. It probably won't. But you'll do the very best. When I say you now, I mean your body-mind will do the very best that it is capable of in expressing this deeper understanding in response to the current situation. It may or may not have an effect that shows immediately, but even if it doesn't show, something will be planted. Something of this silence and this openness, this lack of judgment and this absence of fear that is in you will communicate itself somehow. And it'll sow a seed.
That's great, thank you. Because I've noticed, for instance, sometimes when Catherine and I will have conversation on the phone or whatever, and perhaps one of us will be going off on a narrative, and it's great because suddenly one of us will say, actually, I just can't bother to talk about this anymore. And it's great, so we just have a good laugh, and that's the end of the conversation, because the awareness is there.
Yes, but that in a way is a different situation, because it's a conversation between two people who share this understanding, so you can afford to be much more direct.
Yes.
You know that you can risk it with Catherine.
Yes.
You can say, Catherine, you know, you're talking nonsense.
Yeah.
You know?
Yes.
You didn't really mean that.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
So, but with your family around the table, and it's a different situation.
Yeah, it feels much more delicate somehow.
You can't go directly with a friend. In truth, we can be much more direct in the way that we are here. We speak very directly, but in a situation where we're with another or a group or another person, where with someone who doesn't share this understanding, we can't always be this direct, and sometimes it would be detrimental. It would be inappropriate and insensitive to be so direct. And then we have to be very sensitive and tailor this understanding to the situation, which will usually mean speaking in very dualistic terms, seeming to condone the separate self that they take themselves to be. And so you have to find a way of expressing this understanding, and the criteria should always be this: to provoke as little resistance in the other as possible.
Yeah.
And the way to do that is to go with them, to go to them, to go, if they're going in this direction, you go with them in this direction. You don't try and say, no, it's not like that. You say, okay, you're going in this direction. I'm coming with you.
Yes.
And off you go in this direction. And you just slowly change direction. Maybe not all the way round, but maybe you just come off the course that they were on, just a little bit. Open them to another possibility. That's maybe enough.
Okay.
So provoke as little resistance, because once resistance has been provoked, ego springs back into place, and then we defend ourselves.
Yes.
And anything that's we say after that tends to reinforce this defensive position of the ego. So be sensitive and find ways, and they're always fresh ways in the moment. There are no prescriptions of tailoring this understanding to the moment.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks.